first off, thank you everyone for coming, just showing your support for this event. It's absolutely great. Just seeing the link between the U.S.-Mexico border as well as the Israel and Palestine, as you're going to hear in a little bit from our great speaker, that there's many similarities in terms of both the struggles, just both in fact of the indigenous solidarity between the Palestinians as well as the Mexicans. And also one shocking fact is that the same company that funds the U.S.-Mexico border is also the same one that funds the Israel and Palestinian one. So just things like that, it's absolutely shocking. But to give a brief overview about MEChA, we're an organization that started in the 60s by a high school in Denver, Colorado, just in terms of uprising and also granting the rights of Chicanos. And so it was a movement that spread it out with the idea of finding Aslan, which is the spiritual identity of being close to home, starting in Mexico, but just with Chicano and Chicanao, I should say, identity, and finding it at your heart. So it's really great with MEChA and super because, like I mentioned earlier, the indigenous solidarity and finding links between that. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker, Gabriel.
It's nice to be in Seattle, and it's actually nice to get that right, because I was in Seattle last week, and then I went to a conference with a bunch of people in the crowd, and at this workshop I was like, it's nice to be in Seattle, and it was really embarrassing, and everybody started laughing, but it was nice to open it up like that. So it is really nice to be back in Seattle, and thank you for Super and MEChA for having me. So I was asked to speak about connections between the U.S.-Mexico border, which is where I'm from, a little town along the borderlines called Tucson, if anyone has ever heard of it or been there. And the connection between Palestine and Israel issues. And on that subject, I wanted to open with a quote from one of Israel's most ardent supporters in the United States, called the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL. They have an interesting history, which we could perhaps talk about later, and their subsequent support of liberal issues, including ethnic studies, the attacks on Mexican American studies, and border and migrant justice issues in general. They're quite progressive on that issue, but when it comes to Israel, they're quite fanatically right-wing, and it's interesting to bring that up constantly, especially in front of their Chicana allies, because they have to force to make a choice if they're going to support migrant justice and justice issues in general across the board, or just selectively. But without getting carried away, I wanted to open up with a quote from them because it's very relevant to today's subject. They do annual reports on what they call anti-Israel activity on U.S. campuses, like this one. And their most recent annual report for the 2011-2012 year focuses on what they call two new strategies that they see and warn their minions, organizers, activists about across the country. They say these two new strategies, looking over the past year, were particularly ubiquitous, was their phrasing. And one of the efforts counters what's known as Israeli pinkwashing. Everybody know what that is? A few knows. Well, pinkwashing is essentially a propaganda campaign taken up by the Israeli state to brand itself as a safe haven for LGBTQI-oriented people. And a good way to think of it is kind of washing Israel's crimes and mayhem in this gay-friendly sort of facade. And so there's been lots of grassroots efforts, even raising up to the mainstream with Sarah Schulman, a wonderful piece in the New York Times recently. But this effort, they say, is a new one and ubiquitous. But another one that's very new and equally dangerous is what they call U.S.-Mexico border analogies. And so they say that you better watch out for those. In other words, you better watch out for events like this. And they say that the ubiquitous strategies increase the potential for students to be exposed to hostile narratives about Israel. So I wanted to open with that because although analogies can be very powerful educational tools, as the ADL recognizes, today I'd like to proceed beyond the realm of analogy and go into more concrete human examples of intersection. And if you will, give a few examples pretty briefly, and then I want to open it up and sort of use the rest of the time for reactions, comments, questions, and the like. So if that sounds good. First of all, when speaking about concrete connections, that phrase, the purpose is not to allege any kind of sameness or even likeness. I mean, you can save that for the analogies. But rather, its purpose is to employ critical perspectives. So here's one, and this is by Palestinian human rights lawyer Noda Arakat, who writes that, quote, "The U.S. political establishment, its legislature, executive branch, and judiciary works in concert to construct the national boundaries that include Israel, and by extension the occupied territories. As such, both the U.S. and Israel collude wittingly and unwittingly to form what may be called a border-settler spectrum." And that's the sort of abstract imagery, but as you'll see, we can animate it with real human examples, which I'll get into. But just for the remarks for today, think of this border-settler spectrum that connects the national boundaries of the U.S. and Israel. And hopefully, by the end of the talk, the burden is on me to explain if that seems a little confusing now. So this border-settler spectrum that spans from what we can call the established international borders of the U.S. to Israel's illegally occupied and rapidly expanding territories. In short, the history of U.S. settlement and its current state of border enforcement intersects with Israeli expansion and militarism in the Palestinian territories. So for some historical background, in his essay, Scenes from an Occupation, which is a beautiful essay, I really encourage everyone to check it out, by historian and geographer Joseph Nevins, who's also a leading border scholar on border militarization. Nevins correctly observes that the massive levels of Israeli state settler violence inflicted regularly on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, quote, "are not manifest in today's U.S.-Mexico borderlines, the worst of it having been carried out in the 1800s and early 1900s by U.S. and local authorities, as well as Anglo settlers, as they subjugated and dispossessed the native and pre-conquest Mexican populations," unquote. Overall, he's saying the experiences of Israeli settlers in Palestine today and the descendants of American settlers in the U.S. are markedly different. However, there are some significant and tangible junctures in these areas that don't stop at mere analogy due to past and current levels of violence. Crucial U.S. support of Israeli settler colonial policies today, for instance, provides and long has granted a direct pathway for U.S. citizens to enter a contemporary dimension of brutality that is straight out of the history books of U.S. expansionism, particularly after Israel's 1967 War of Conquest, just before which a U.S. Supreme Court ruling allowed dual U.S.-Israeli citizenship. That would have been May 1967, and the war was in June 1967. The number of American Jews leaving overseas to reside in Israel and the occupied territories increased dramatically and have continued to the present day at remarkably consistent levels. And the one who's done the best research on this just finished her dissertation at the University of Chicago, and I really highly recommend her research on it as well. Her name is Sarah Hirschhorn, and her dissertation is called City on a Hill, I believe. And she's now at Brandeis, but her work is really good. It's the only real work that I've seen where she had access to unprecedented, prior inaccessible information from the U.S. State Department and from the Israeli Census Bureau and Israeli statistics. And her research showed that today at least 15% of Israeli settlers occupying the West Bank, which is an extremely conservative estimate, which doesn't include occupied East Jerusalem, hold U.S. citizenship, illustrating the ease with which a group of U.S. citizens is able to travel on this spectrum and directly participate this minute in a similar brand of violent dispossession that their American settler ancestors led against indigenous Native Americans, with much of the same apologist justifications. The experiences of these Americans is most dramatic in the occupied territories, where they take on their new role as Israeli military soldier or settler, or both. In fact, as soldier, these American citizens receive a host of special benefits. The New York Times reported last August in an article entitled "Enlisting from Afar for the Love of Israel." The quote-unquote special benefits include 3 times the typical soldier's salary, a personal day off each month, a free flight home, and vouchers for holiday meals. As the Colonel Shuli Ayal observes, he oversees this special military program. He observes that their motivation is often way higher than the average Israeli. Moreover, American Jewish settlers themselves are not the only products of the U.S. Special relationship with Israel. Accompanying these U.S. settlers to the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly within Israel's illegal settlement industry, are lessons from the American system of exploitation of cheap labor provided by mostly Mexican migrants in the U.S. Under these circumstances, Palestinian laborers are known as Mexicans due to the process of what's called manual pruning, preferred by settlement employers within the industrial fruit groves in the occupied Jordan Valley, and specifically within the fruit groves, we're talking about palm date trees. Quote, because the manual method was used in California, Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported in recent years, and the workers in question were hard-scrabble Mexicans, this process came to be known in the industry as, quote, Mexican pruning. Now, not surprisingly, these Palestinian Mexicans are treated with comparable fear and disdain in Israeli society as illegal human beings, also not surprising, just as their counterparts in the U.S. A news report in Haaretz from early last year entitled, Border Police Train Israeli Teens to Detain Illegal Palestinian Workers, describes the operations of the Israeli Public Security Ministry's Teenage Border Patrol youth. Armed with U.S.-made M16 assault rifles, the teens had helped, quote, catch dozens of illegal aliens, mostly Palestinian workers who lack Israeli work permits, unquote. In the weeks leading up to the report, the youth also participated in other security operations, including guarding the checkpoints and surrounding settlements in the Modahin area. And the report quoted a youth named Roy, a high school senior at the time, who joyously reflected, I like catching the Palestinian workers. Generally, we look for them because they scare children. The point is to catch them and return them back where they belong. So, meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum in the U.S., those on the receiving end feel fear in a different way. Quote, 18 years we've lived in fear and shame, says Ala Mugahal, an undocumented Palestinian youth activist living in Chicago, reflecting on her family's immigration status. Though most undocumented populations living in the U.S. are Mexican, the experience touches many others, including Palestinians like Ala. Quoting her again, I can't cut myself up into different pieces and issues, she explains. My struggle as an undocumented person is intertwined with who I am as a Palestinian. The reason I am undocumented today is directly connected with what happened in 1948, when Israel conquered 78% of historic Palestine before taking over the remaining 22% in 1967 through military occupation and settlement that continues to this day with firm U.S. support. quoting her conclusion, "The struggles, though not the same, intersect and intertwine." So again, it was an honor that MEChA co-sponsored this event, because I'm about to plug the national group. An important decision was made just a month ago at the 20th annual conference of MEChA. The conference voted by a landslide majority to work with Students for Justice in Palestine and related groups like SUPER, quote, "until the Palestinian people are liberated." This year's conference drew on an even sharper focus over last year's, when the 19th National MEChA Conference voted to endorse the Palestinian-led movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, on Israel. And in fact, I was glad to hear that just about a week ago in Seattle, a conference of the AAAS, is that raised in 8 years? People know what that is, the Association of Asian American Studies, reportedly became the first academic association to vote at their conference for boycotting Israeli academic institutions, which are very complicit with the occupation, in the same sort of gesture as MEChA. As organizers of National Students for Justice in Palestine wrote on our website in the lead up to this year's MEChA gathering, quote, "Finding common ground was a key step, but now we need to find a common path." And the common path that we're talking about, when I say we, I mean the National Steering Committee of SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, which at our last national conference had representatives from MEChA. The sort of common path we're talking about is on the ground level at all the grassroots local chapters throughout the country. So in other words, the common path is through events like this and through employing these critical perspectives and thinking creatively on how to move forward and support each other's struggles here and in Palestine across this common spectrum I've been talking about. And from nowhere in the world is this common path in greatest need of pavement than in the United States, where we can actually shift the dominant narratives and power structures that create and are perpetuating the lasting oppression. And so that's like sort of the note I'd like to end and open up for discussion. Like I said, I actually was brief, and a lot of times I tend to talk a lot, so I'm glad that this was more brief. I hope that some people have critical comments or questions or disagreements. Like, in fact, I'd like to open up first, if that's cool, with anybody who has been burning throughout this whole time with intense disagreement. And I think like that's a good start for the discussion, to catch the tension in the room head on and then take it from there. I don't know if the groups want to moderate or if we don't want to moderate, whatever. I'm open for whatever y'all want.
Will you take questions?
I can take questions, sure. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you in order. Do you want to do a few at a time and then come back?
Sure, whatever you want.
All right, so go for it.
Oh, right. This isn't an intense disagreement or anything. But I saw you were, I think on the bio, you said you were part of the Flotilla to Gaza. I was just wondering, was really curious to hear any kind of personal experiences and from that, and just any thoughts you had.
Okay.
Okay, I don't disagree with you. But I was wondering, as part of a common path, it might be something to consider, since it's so obviously connected, and you've got the history is being repeated on another, in another country, with some of, different nationalities clashing, but it's still to be exploring the common analysis of capitalism and imperialism as a causative factor because obviously you can't solve a problem if you don't know why it's happening and what the cause is. And there's a desperate need in the movements for a bold anti-capitalist and or pro-socialist analysis, where people aren't skirting around and talking just about greed and you know, corporatization and stuff. It is a capitalist system that's causing the problem, and I think it would be so helpful to everybody. It shows, you know, like leadership, to be able to be saying what everybody else is thinking or what they don't know what to call it. And the other point I wanted to make, and I just want to know what you think about that. And the other point was that I'm hoping MEChA is taking a position against Obama's phony reforms, which would doubly militarize the border and really not be a path for citizenship, just a path to indentured servitude for people coming over here in cheap labor.
Okay. It's open right now. And while people are speaking, you can feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll kind of call on you in that order. I'll make eye contact. But anyone else right now? Yeah. Go for it.
Oh, so you talked about the similarities, and I was just wondering if you could kind of lay out a timeline where like this country and the state of Israel sort of became more militarized and xenophobic. I know there's lots of flashpoints in history, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe the sort of the underpinnings of that xenophobia.
Whatever you want.
Come back and think of more questions, and then maybe we'll come back and get a few more. Do we have one? Oh. Yeah.
I was curious if you could speak about if you see like the I don't know more movement and indigenous struggles, like how that intersects with Palestinian struggles and borders and deportation.
Want to come back on those and then do
Sure. Yeah, maybe we can go backward from the last question to the first. I don't know no more definitely very much permeates the discussion when we talk about connections, I think. And I was very happy to see Palestinian youth-led movements right when I don't know more was really taking off, writing great statements of solidarity. And but I also feel I'm in the area to hear and learn a lot more about those that are the human elements leading the charge, and I don't know more. Like, given how far north I am, more used to being much farther south. So I would like to open it up to, I don't know if you have anything to add on more. Or
I was curious what your reflection was.
Sure. Well, and as for the second question back, the timeline when the U.S. and Israel sort of became like latched on to each other strategically, is that what you were asking?
Specifically, the militarization of the border.
Of the U.S.-Mexico border? Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's a little bit more recent phenomenon, and you could sort of trace it, at least in a pinpointedly in a very massive machinery type way. Back in 2006 is when the Bush administration passed the Secure Fence Act. Fence, of course, is a euphemism, is not even like to put it mildly, it's just a lie. There's a huge infrastructure of ditches and roads and walling infrastructure, cement, metal barriers that scar the borderlands all across. But, you know, especially in Arizona, it leaves like this hole because part of the, it's called deterrence strategy that the U.S. Border Patrol and state planners chose to militarize the border is away from prior forms of militarization when they militarized the urban areas along the border, traditional points of entry they called it, and employed enforcement measures after migrants had crossed. And so the shift was to commit a forward deployment and then wall off intensely the urban centers, and thereby shift migration routes into, as a 1994 Border Patrol planning document called it, the geographically harsh, hazardous, and areas of mortal danger, to effectively use those geography and turn the terrain into killing fields as a way of deterrence. If we kill just enough people, then that will deter others from crossing. And since then, the reality has played out according to plan. At least about 6,000 human remains have been recovered of migrants since that time. And I emphasize at least because the medical examiners and human rights groups will be the first to tell you that it's the least of all estimate that we have, and the actual numbers are unknown, and they much more exceed that, probably 2 or 3 times or more, because we just don't know. And imperial powers like the U.S., they never bother to count their victims, but if it's their own victims, they know right down to the last body and person and all that. And so in 2006 was just this dramatic increase after increase after increase of militarization. I mean, just to give a little bit of idea, without giving too much statistics that can dilute understandings of what goes on along the border. It took the Border Patrol over 50 years to grow just from 0 to 2,000 agents. And that was between 1924 when it started to the late 1970s. But since this militarization, you have under Clinton, he increased it to 4,500, so he doubled it. And so around 2000, it's about 10,000. And under Bush, and then Obama doubled that. So you see the pattern is doubling it over doubling it and doubling it. So now under Obama, we have 21,000 Border Patrol agents on the border. And Nevins, Joe Nevins, who I mentioned earlier, he's been studying this for a long, long time. And he says that when he started studying it, if someone would tell him within 10 years, crazy. But this has been the strategy to this balloon type imagery that is very suitable to what's actually going on. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and so 21,000 now, and the so-called immigration reform package aims to add 3,500 more. And so it's just it's exponentially growing and growing and growing. And there's lots of imagery of an occupied force, and Nevins looks at that in the essay that I really encourage all of you to read. It's a fantastic read, and it's a grueling read as well. But it's an accurate picture about what's going on the border and where parts intersect with Israel-Palestine issues. And so go to 2006, the Secure Fence Act. Basically what it is the Bush administration wrote in a blank check for the private sector to be paid money from the public sector, from all of our pockets, to create and implement these corporate projects to fill that gap and to give shape and form to the new policies. And like MEChA said in the beginning, Allied Systems is one of the companies that shared a contract with Boeing to build this ridiculous, they called it they're essentially these towers that are along the border, and they were supposed to create this thing they called a virtual fence. And even under their crazy standards, it didn't even work. And so after several years, the Obama administration scrapped the whole project. But Elbit and Boeing, they still got to take the money, of course, which always happens with projects like that, whether or not they work, whether it's a missile system or not. The whole point is to transfer funds from the public sector into the private sector, and to fill the coffers of the corporate elites and enrich their friends and everything and all that. And Elba was one of those. And so in 2006 is kind of this groundswell. And along the border now, more and more Israeli companies are clamoring to enter this border security market because it's a huge boon for developments and giving the technology that Israel likes to brag that it's battle-proven, battle-tested in the best laboratory in the world for these sorts of things, in Gaza especially and in the West Bank, that they can sort of commit this export of Palestinian suffering and sell to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder is the United States. And the most lucrative market right now is the border security market. And that was made sure, even more sure, with this immigration reform package. More than $5 billion earmarked for more projects. However crazy they sound, however creative and crazy they sound and they are. And so if you go to these defense expos, they have El Paso and in Phoenix, where they, lots of companies, Israeli and other companies from around the world too, and U.S. companies displaying drones, displaying every new gadget that they want to peddle for the government to come and buy it. And the sources on the ground in the business sector are showing that Israeli companies, again, more and more are just dumping, pouring right in with all their other ideas and everything. And the next question was imperialism and capitalism. Yeah, I bet that has become a little bit more clear, but we can even be more specific that settler colonial projects and settler colonial movements have always had this element of imperialism, capitalism, for example, where I'm from in Arizona, the University of Arizona, my hometown university, where you have the three major problems of the Anglo settlers, and right after all the territory was stolen by the U.S. in a brutal war of aggression that we should feel pretty ashamed about. It was quite a horrible war and everything that happened. And there was overnight, the huge tracts of land that were stolen and they were right there ready, but it presented like this huge logistical problem, like how are you going to incorporate all that land? A lot of it was in the way because the prize possession all the while was California, and the settler movement and those who were lobbying for the war always had their sights on California for its resources and abundance and beautiful rolling hills and all that. And then all these other lands were sort of in the way. And Arizona was one of them. And throughout all that time, after the war especially, the settlements remained unincorporated because of three major problems. And the first problem always, first and foremost, was the presence of indigenous peoples. Like they just didn't get it. They just would not go away. The Navajos were subjugated, but then towards the end of the century, the Apache, different groups of Apaches from all over Arizona were just continually to be recalcitrant and stubborn, and would just not get it that the lands that they were born on didn't belong to them. It belonged to the settlers. And so that was number one problem. The second problem was this detachment. The settlements of Tucson, Prescott, and Phoenix at the time were unconnected with the rest of the country. There were no railroads that went through them. And the third problem was simple and really gets into very clearly into issues of imperialism and within it capitalism. There was no settler-driven industry, no independent industry. They were dependent on military spending for economic health. They were dependent on U.S. military and local force for protection from these savages who were merciless, which is a colorful word of Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Merciless Indian savages. So all three of those problems, as long as those three were there, they would remain to be settlements. And that's the problem, right? Like The problem with settlements is in the very name. Settlements are a temporary thing. Like for settlers to win, like they have to cease being settlements. They have to gain permanence and cement their presence in the land while vanquishing the indigenous population. And interestingly, right around the same time, we're talking 1885, 1886. 1885 was when the U of A was founded, and 1886 was when the history books show us the so-called the symbolic surrender of Geronimo. And you have in that small window all three problems taken care of. So the railroads were built through Arizona. At the same time, the U of A claimed the Merrill Act of 1862, which was a public policy to try and incorporate all the settlements in all of the lands. It was a federal policy by putting out these incentives. In other words, federal funding for universities to pop up all over these territories. Because universities serve as not only cultural centers, but they serve as, especially if they're agriculture and mining, which was the case of the U of A, they serve as stimulating institutions. In the words of the Arizona settler legislators, they were territorial money-spending institutions. So if we can get rid of the indigenous population, connect the settlements with the rest of the country, and then get our own institutions running and generating revenue, income, and attracting more settlers and transplants to come here, study, build roots, and all of that, then it's over. We've won. We've won peace and reconciliation and everything else that you can think of. It sounds nice, but it's false. And that'll happen in other territorial institutions in the same legislature session, along with the U of A, or an insane asylum and a prison. And so that also connects a direct line to today, the prison industrial complex, the function of prisons, and especially when we're talking about immigration and border enforcement. I mean, the sort of impetus for, or is it impetus? I always read it first as impetus and then pronounce it impetus. The impetus, or impetus of laws like SB 1070 was to fill the coffers of the private prison complex. So that's the lobby that created the legislation. And CCA, Geo Group, Wells Fargo, these were the main targets and continue to be the main targets, although lots of ground has been gained in divestment efforts or BDS against these companies. Wells Fargo, after this wonderful national campaign by migrant justice movement, Wells Fargo just very recently dropped 75% of its shares in CCA, and that was since 2010 was a major call of this movement. And so, like BDS activists and the migrant justice movement have made very, very clear and very inspiring wins, and there's more to be fought. Like the CCA Geo Group, they still profit immensely from this sort of legislation and the enforcement sort of complex, and it's just gathering and increasing with this so-called reform package. And so to bring it back to the question, the extractive industries that comes along with settler colonialism is deeply and directly tied in things like capitalism, imperialism itself before the frontiers were closed by the end of the 19th century was a form of domestic imperialism, but when all of the land was stolen, then we have to start going outward. And it ties in with the Israeli relationship, especially after 1967. That's when it was all cemented. And the first question on the flotilla. So personal experiences. For one thing, it was the first time I had ever left the United States. I don't know how interesting these things might be, but it was very eye-opening. I had never been to Athens before, and the whole point behind the flotilla, for those of you that may not have heard of it, Israel's closure policy on Gaza and then blockade and siege policies that ensued. And these are also increased. You know, like the separation really of the West Bank and Gaza started happening around like a similar time when border militarization along the U.S.-Mexico border was really taking off. And we're talking about the 1990s, early 1990s, and became exponentially more brutal, especially after the democratic election of Hamas, and several years ago. And so one of the ways to try and get in aid, but that was actually just like a byproduct of the Flotilla movement, was humanitarian aid. The main purpose was to resist and an act of defiance and international direct action in a high-profile way, to force this issue of Israeli occupation, and especially the siege in Gaza, which is not being talked about in the world stage, to really force the issue to be discussed. So the specific boat that I was on was called the U.S. Boat to Gaza, and it was one boat and a bunch of boats that were to defy Israel's illegal siege and blockade of Gaza. And the summer before, Israel had forcibly boarded what's called Flotilla I, and in a brutal invasion of the ships, they murdered 9 passengers on the huge ship called the Mavi Marmara, and one of them was a 19-year-old U.S. citizen of Turkish descent, and they shot him in the face and shot him 6 times. So it was quite brutal. There was a UN fact-finding mission, and it was very clear that these were executions, that this was a massacre. And so the flotilla that I was on the next summer had a huge amount of media attention, which really showed us before we even left New York that we had won the media war, in a way you could say, because the whole purpose was to raise attention forcibly on the issues, especially in the U.S., that are, if they're not talked about, they're distorted and misrepresented, everything. So the fact that the Greek governments arrested all of us and didn't let our ships sail was just kind of irrelevant. And at the same time, I got to, because we're all stuck in Athens for several weeks, we got to give support, much needed support, to black blockers, occupiers of, and this was before the Occupy movement had started, and black blockers had occupied the square across from Parliament in Athens, and there were Palestinians there as well, refugees who were Athenian, but also Palestinian. And they have a huge support for Palestine solidarity, so they were actually raising, and this was one more insult that their government was doing, stopping these internationals from going. So they had organized lots of actions as well in support of us. These huge, monstrous actions. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, being here in the political climate that is often much too tame, as a really sad and sharp contrast to how much privileges we have in this country. And so those are a few of the personal experiences. I know some of them might not be very interesting, but that was the question, right?
Take another round, so start with Ed. And while he's speaking, feel free to keep your hand up and I'll try to call on you in the order that you got raised. So.
Are you acquainted with the status of the maquiladora-style industrial zones in the West Bank and in Jordan? And in any case, can you talk at all about the relationship between border security culture and industrial zone culture, both in Mexico and Palestine?
Go Aaron, and then after Aaron.
So a question I have is kind of about the flotilla, as we're on the flotilla, and what is your take on the recent reconciliation process between the Turkish government and the Israeli government, and what is seemingly rebounded to a state of normal relations between the countries, the compensation deal, and if that will result in the siege in Gaza being lifted or not. Essentially, what's your personal take on that, having been part of those events?
Yes, I want to thank you for your presentation and sharing all that information. It's information one normally doesn't hear. I have a question just on the E-Verify card that's, I think, being used now. And that's identity cards for undocumented workers. And to me, it has a really potential of filtering down, since how are you going to discern an undocumented worker from a documented worker? So it has a potential of affecting, elements.
Yeah, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, since there are so many great and passionate activists in the room already. Given the push and pull factors with immigration, in Mexico you have the passing of the North American Free Trade Agreement by the IMF and the World Bank in regards to essentially over-industrializing and forcing Mexico to participate in the global market to the point where you're forcing Mexican workers to cross the border and come to the United States. And then in the United States you have the push factors that you spoke eloquently to in regards to, in addition with Obama essentially doubling the rate of deportations as well. I mean, I see so many activists in the room. You have Super and MEChA, obviously, and then you have Students United sweatshops here. You have sexual literacy in the back. You have Amnesty over here, and maybe a bunch of new people here, and as well as CISPIS. I don't know if people want to give call-outs in regards to what people want to work on now, in regards to current coalition building or actions in the works. And I don't know if new people here want to get involved in any of this, but I see a very distinct opportunity to form something or talk about something in the here and now, to do something here. And I don't know if you have any examples in regards to coalition building, or you mentioned BDS as well, in regards to what you've experienced in your travels as to what you might recommend.
Yeah, I feel like that's the most exciting thing that I could imagine happening tonight. So I feel like I'd be willing to even just like try and like sacrifice the rest of the time for that kind of organizing, however the room wants to do it. How about I like briefly go through the rest of the questions, and however y'all want to organize, if people are into that, I feel like that's really amazing and really really awesome. Whether breaking out or meeting, I don't know, however the organizers would like to lead something like that, but all up to you. But I'm like totally all for that, I mean, especially when all these when everybody's in the room at one time, one place. It's really a valuable opportunity. But while you're thinking about it, let me go really quick. On the question of E-Verify, you sort of answered the question. I mean, it's incredibly frightening and very serious element in a larger complex of border security and immigration. And it shows that it doesn't just stop at so-called immigrants, migrants, the other. This is a standard form of social control, and it's one of those things which doesn't stop ever until enough resistance and pushback from below will force it to do away with it, shift it in the short term and long term. The so-called reconciliation, I was reading about that this morning, and I feel like my personal opinion is that, we can hear what the Israeli government, the U.S. government, I mean, the image, there's one of image and reality. The image is that the U.S. is this honest broker in between these two formerly, like, friendly nations. It was just a load of crap, total crap. The U.S. has never been an honest broker. It's been the enabler of so much violence and suffering. And as with the other parts of the image, that this is an opportunity for reconciliation, it's also crap. I mean, the ones who if any of us would care or pay attention, the ones who are in the middle of it, but who aren't really being given enough quotes, surprisingly, in the mainstream press, are the very plaintiffs. And many of them are the bereaved wives of their husbands. If we go down their reactions, they're all insulted. they're completely insulted. And wife after wife after wife is saying that would reject any kind of compensation and apology, and then they are rejecting them. And the only demand that they will settle for is Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories and ending the siege of Gaza. And so that's my personal opinion is the support of the plaintiffs and their very honorable and brave positions that often because it is true, the Israeli-Turkish alliance, the security, militarization, governments are always friendly with each other, they act, they think alike. And it was very brave on part of the plaintiffs to, irrespective of whatever the government says, and whatever Israel says, and whatever the U.S. says, that the plaintiffs and grassroots international activists are remaining steadfast and really grounded in those principles that are calling, as they have been since November 1967, that Israel withdraw unconditionally from the occupied territories. Because as the UN said, the acquisition, to quote the Resolution 242 of November 1967, the acquisition of territory by war is illegal. The acquisition by territory by war is illegal. And that's one of the few main supreme international crimes, right up there with genocide, with torture, and the reason why territorial aggrandizement is right up there with all these other crimes is quite simply because it is one of the most devastating and unjust things that humans can do to one another. Forcibly take land away from indigenous peoples is right up there with genocide, and often goes hand in hand with genocide. And it's one of those, there's a fancy term, legal terminology. See, it's so fancy I don't even remember what it is. But there's a fancy term for those supreme international crimes, and one of them is the acquisition of territory by war. Did someone say it? No, it's something else. It's the Latin, of course. It just means the supreme crime. If anyone wants to look it up. So maybe it'll come to me later. And that's the thing, it doesn't even really matter, it's such a fancy term, I don't like using big words. Like Malcolm X said, he says that, I don't like using a lot of big words, because I talk often to small people. And the big people use the big words and try to confuse the small people, and no one understands them. Academics have a role in that as well. And so I like using small words and to small people like myself, and because I feel like you can get a lot more small people together, as he said, and whip hell out of the small amounts of big people. As a little aside rant. But the first question on industrial zones and border security culture. The first thing that pops to mind is that it's nothing new, really, and even kind of can exist independently from border security culture in a way. If you look at a little bit deeper to, say, we go back to the Prohibition era, for example, some big, you can call them industrial zones, were operating all along the border, just on the other side when the border was still a line in the sand. And a lot of them would be drink houses, bars, saloons, brothels, and places like that were a huge booming business when all of that was illegal in the U.S., especially alcohol, during the Prohibition era. Whenever you have the U.S. or a government kind of prohibiting, you can see it really clearly, especially now in the so-called war on drugs. You have a prohibition system. You often below that, you see lots of exploitation and social cleansing happening in the name of it, and demonizing a social class who seem to be the peddlers, who are stigmatized as the peddlers of that. So for example, I think it was Al Capone in an interview. He says that I love capitalism, and those are his words. He says that he was basically reproducing the American dream. It was quite an interesting interview. he was saying that I love this country, I love capitalism, call it what you want, call it capitalism, call it greed. I love it because it gives all of us the same opportunity to enrich ourselves. And this is the best goddamn country on earth. I mean, that's what he was saying. And the interviewer, who was a Guardian journalist, was also noticed that Capone was dipping his fingers in rose water for some reason. And he was, when he was talking and shaking in the rapture of the moment, like this rose water was dripping off his fingers. And I think it's very illuminating because this small-time racketeer criminal is speaking the same language of the huge, larger racketeer criminals in the government. And they often think alike, they speak alike. And I want to plug someone I really admire, Noam Chomsky. He wrote this book called Pirates and Emperors, and he opens the book with this passage by St. Augustine, who was describing this exchange between the emperor and this international terrorist. And the emperor says, "How dare you molest the sea? How dare you molest my sea?" And the pirate replies, "How dare you molest the whole world? I molest, you're saying what I do is molest with a little ship only, but you have this grand empire, and you have all these fleets and everything, and there's no difference except that you do it on a much larger and more brutal and infinitely more destructive scale." So it may be an indirect way of answering the question, but before issues of capitalism and things like that are deeply rooted there, and we have much more in common with each other than cartels and small-time crooks have with the big-time crooks. They have more in common, and we all have more in common, and that also goes back to like concrete connections. You know, like at the end of the day, our analysis, I think, has to go well beyond issues of race and much deeper into issues of political economy and class, because all you have to do to get sucked into and be confused by the sort of rhetoric of, for example, the Latino Jewish caucus, it's called, in Congress. These politicians who are Chicano or MEChA politicians, they'll be saying how much they love Israel, and in their particularly honest moments, they'll be saying how, and this is in a Jewish Forward recently about the caucus, quoting a politician who says that, I really admire what the Jews have been able to do. I mean, the anti-Semitism is just glaring, but the Jewish Daily Forward, nobody complains because it's all in support of Israel. The Jews, they're really great. I love them because they're such a small amount of the population and been able to gain so much influence and so much power. You know, I want that for the Latino people in the United States. And so, this is one way to step back and to see that that's another way that what we really see is not race at the end of the day, it's political commitment and it's political intention. And at the end of the day, the people who want power and people who lust after power make connections, make their own concrete connections, and those who have a political commitment and struggle for these issues of grassroots justice also make their own concrete connections. So it should be thought of, I think, like that. There are governments making their concrete connections, and then there are grassroots activists who are making their concrete connections, and what ensues is conflict, and the more we push and organize, as many recent events have shown, governments can topple. You can have some even glimpses throughout history of radical regeneration and redistribution of the wealth and labor and privilege.